of the Independent Social Research Foundation. And as you can tell from the name, we fund social research. And what struck me when I was getting ready to be interviewed for my current job at the foundation, which is just a couple of years ago, is that much of this research focuses on how individuals and groups actually experience society as they act upon it. It focuses on, it is the research that we fund, on what I think of as the inner life of society. Julia Laite's book is an example of how powerful this work can be. She writes early on that the title character, Lydia Harvey, appeared through the crevice of the archive as a young woman who crossed two oceans, walked the streets of world cities, denounced her abusers, and reinvented herself. This glimpse poses a temptation for the historian that she could use Lydia Harvey as an illustration of great historical themes. Here, global sex trafficking towards the end of the era of the white slavery panic, which links up with global labor migration of millions of women left home in search of better work in the early 1900s. But Julia writes, the more I put Lydia Harvey into a wider historical context, the more she herself faded from view. And so I tugged at the threads of the archive in which she briefly appeared and began to unravel the stories inside. Julia brings Lydia forward, saving her from the fate of those sweeping histories in which girls like Lydia become nobodies. Julia also does the extraordinary work of bringing the entire cast forward with a chapter, for example, on one of Lydia Harvey's traffickers, a chapter on the other trafficker as well, with material on the long-term relationship between the two traffickers. The book is also a kind of a trafficker love story. And there's also a chapter apiece on the main detectives, on a New Zealand journalist in London, among other very active figures involved in creating this history. The story is told and then retold so the same events recur from different angles in an ensemble cast. I mean, I grew up in Los Angeles and realized while reading that I would have pitched this book there as Rashomon meets Pulp Fiction. The book's story has multiple origins, and many of the main characters wind up not far from where they started years before, in Italy, Argentina, England, France, Australia, or New Zealand. And there is a continuous dynamic between colonial power and colonial settlement. In each place, Julia analyzes the police. Today we're in another post-civil rights wave of rethinking the police, both in the context of calls for defunding the police after the murder of George Floyd, among many others in the US, and to different effect, the police murder of Sarah Everard here in London. Julia devotes a chapter to a tireless social worker in London named Ailey McDougall. In 1908, McDougall is appointed as lady assistant to the Metropolitan Police, where her job is to take statements from women and girls who had been trafficked and assaulted. In this job, and in the rescue organization she founded, McDougall worked for decades to set down the statements of hundreds or thousands of women, statements that record what Julia calls the suffering and the bravery of victims that she interviewed. Real justice rarely happens in these cases, and yet real history does. McDougall refuses to see the women as criminalized by sex work. She insists on long-term aftercare for abused women, and she refuses to become a police employee, maintaining her independence as a social worker. Julia's book often reminds us that our public systems are not taking us towards the worlds we say we want, and that these entrenched systems really could work otherwise. Ailey McDougall's long labors are a good reminder that actual people have already put at least limited alternatives to policing, among other systems, into practice, and that these alternatives can continue to develop no matter the hostility of the environment. Julia's book is the fifth in the ISRF second season of book launches. We published a bulletin on a theme that emerged over last year's 10 books on post-individualism, which you have, in most cases, on your seats. By that term, we mean a system in which social relations and individuals mutually support each other rather than threaten and damage each other. This year, we've launched Ilan Ruhl-Wall's book on the role of affects in political movements, Mike Macon-Waite's book on how community interventions dealt with the white supremacist surge in Burnley, Alexander Stingel's work on how digitalization might be redesigned to reduce rather than feed precaricized labor, and Jonathan Saha's book, colonizing animals, on how the colonial project decimated non-human creatures while also depending on them. This research, including the research that we're going to hear more about tonight, forms a kind of invisible college that I'm honored and happy to be part of, and I'm extremely grateful to the authors and also to their respondents for their work and their thought and their generosity. So thank you, panelists, and also thank you very much in the audience for the group gathered here this evening, who I'm very pleased to be physically among. So as Lars mentioned, we'll hear from Julia for 15 minutes or so, and then from two of our expert commentators, Matt Holbrook and from the University of Birmingham, and Siobhan Hearn from Durham University, each for 5 to 7 minutes, although we're pretty flexible as these things go. Then Julia can respond if she would like to, and after that the floor will be open and we'll be inviting full participation then. I'm going to introduce them now, sort of right before they each speak, so we'll just do Julia first. Julia Laite is a reader in modern history in the Department of History, Classics and Archaeology at Birkbeck College, London. She joined Birkbeck in 2010 after holding postdoctoral fellowships at Memorial University of Newfoundland, where she also took her bachelor's degree, and McGill University in Montreal. She received an MPhil and PhD from the University of Cambridge. She has written about microhistory, digital methodologies, and history from below, as well as about the topics on display in The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, the history of migration, women and gender, sex and sexual labor, family history, and public history. She has written articles on abolitionism and prostitution law in Britain in the 20th century, on extractive industries and their relation to sex work, on justifiable sensationalism, and on small history in a digital age. Her first book was Common Prostitutes and Ordinary Citizens, and it examined the criminalization of prostitution in 19th and 20th century London. She has recently co-authored with Samantha Caslin a critical source edition of the Wolfenden Report called Wolfenden's Women. She was the principal investigator of the AHRC-funded project Trafficking Past with co-investigator Philippa Hetherington, which has built an international network of scholars researching the history of trafficking, smuggling, and illicit migration in gendered and historical perspective. She has guest edited a special issue of the Journal of Women's History on this topic with Dr. Hetherington, and she is currently developing a new project on family history, migration, race, and settler colonialism. Julia, the podium is yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
Hello, everyone, and it's really funny. Thank you, Christopher, for that wonderful introduction. And it's funny that you should say Rashomon meets Pulp Fiction, because I was initially trying to pitch the book as The Wire, but history. So extremely similar spirit of the thing, and I think it shows that you really get it. And before I begin, I really want to thank Siobhan and Matt for joining me here in person in London. Very exciting to offer their comments on the book. And I want to thank the Independent Social Research Foundation, first for organizing this wonderful launch, which is really most appreciated. But secondly, for being the first funder of this book project, for offering me the first chance to start experimenting with some of the ideas I was thinking about around trafficking. Now, what I told them I was going to write was a traditional history of trafficking, the law and its implementation in late 19th and early 20th century Britain, in a period that put in place a lot of the laws and policies and ideologies and discourses that we still live under the shadow of regarding trafficking in the present day. And I remain really deeply interested in these questions, in the spaces between what a moral panic is about, what the law that emerges from it actually says and does, and most crucially, the space between this law and its ideological underpinnings and what actually happens. And I think if I was going to summarize a lot of my work to date, that is the central theme of everything. What is the space between the law and the ideology, and what actually happens on the ground, in particular to the people who are the target of those laws, like Lydia Harvey. But anyone who read this book will know that it is not a general history of trafficking in the UK in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's not what I ended up doing. Although hidden within it, I hope at least, is a very readable and very complete history of these laws and these ideologies. So instead, I ended up writing a global microhistory that attempts to piece together the story of Lydia Harvey, who was a young woman, a nobody from New Zealand. She was born in 1893 in Dunedin, later moved to Oamaru, where she grew up, and then left Oamaru when she was 16 years old to go to Wellington to work as a domestic servant. And it was there that she met a beautiful woman and a handsome man named Veronique White and Antonio Cavelli, who promised her that she would have wonderful dresses and an exciting life, and she'd be able to travel if she came with them to Buenos Aires in 1910. Once she arrived in Buenos Aires, the truth about what she was expected to do, which is sell sex, became apparent. And her story ends up with her being abandoned on the streets of London and eventually found by the Metropolitan Police and coerced or encouraged, I still haven't quite decided on that front, to become the star witness in the trial against her traffickers. As Christopher mentioned, the book is a kind of history in the round, telling Lydia's story from her own perspective, but also the stories whose lives briefly entangled with hers. The police officers who first noticed the case and who brought it eventually to some semblance of justice. The New Zealand journalist, Guy Scholefield, who later became a famous New Zealand historian in his own right, who broke the case in New Zealand newspapers. The social worker, Eileen McDougall, who took in the victims in the case and helped craft their witness statements. And then also the trafficker himself, Antonio Cavelli, and his larger-than-life story. I could have written an entire book about him, and you're welcome to ask me why I didn't in questions. And finally, his wife and accomplice, Veronique White, the most difficult character in the whole story. And so that's what I ended up writing. So sorry, Independent Social Research Foundation, for slightly tweaking my original idea. But I want to, in the few minutes I have to speak, I want to talk about why I ended up doing it this way and why I wrote the book that I did. And it arose from two preoccupations. Firstly, from the growing awareness that I had as a historian of prostitution and trafficking of the way that trafficking stories were told and still are told. And I refer to this in the book and elsewhere as an anecdotalization, in which short and easily told stories are used by journalists and especially by organizations like anti-trafficking organizations to illustrate the horrors of sex trafficking. We do this to, the common phrase in the present day is raise awareness. We do it to sell newspapers. We do it to sell films. And ostensibly, we also do it to raise money and help those victims. But really, the young women in these stories, and they're almost always young women, even in the present day, appear for just a moment. They're abused, exploited, and entirely divorced from the context of their own doubtlessly complex lives. Little mention is made in these stories of their exploitation in other kinds of work. And these stories also play on a very comfortable dichotomy between victim and villain, where people fall into those tidy roles very easily, and it doesn't get too complicated. And so, as I researched trafficking in those early days with my fellowship, and I started reading through the archives, reading through the publications of anti-trafficking organizations which sprung up in the early 20th century world, I became obsessed with the idea of finding out more, of recontextualizing these young women who appear so attenuated in these short anecdotes or little case files or brief moments in the archive, and sort of putting more of a kind of nuanced and contextualized face on the stories we tell about trafficking. And also, simultaneously, and this goes back to my original intent, of radically contextualizing the whole anti-trafficking machinery, of putting complex human faces not just on the victims of trafficking, but on the people who are in charge of doing something about it, the police, the social workers, the journalists. And also, of course, considering their failures and the way that they are the sort of arbiters of what the law says and what really happens. And so the book is, in many ways, a Trojan horse book. I've said that in several different scenarios, and I don't know if anyone quite gets what I mean. But I wanted people to pick it up and think that it was just another trafficking story, because if you go and you search on the Dread Amazon for books about trafficking, you will find dozens and dozens and dozens that look extremely similar. Most of them have incredibly similar cover imagery, actually, of young women who look very distressed. And I wanted people to pick up The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey and be attracted to it because it was a story about trafficking. I want people who care about trafficking to read it. But I want them to come away with what's hopefully a more nuanced and complicated and challenging view of this immense social problem. And to that end, I must really thank my publishers at Profile and my editor, Louisa, who really got that from the beginning, because I was really determined to write a trade book, a book that people would want to read beyond academia. And that was one of my biggest motivations for doing so, is to challenge those prevailing narratives. My publishers really got that and worked with me to write a complex book that nonetheless, I hope, appeals to a wider audience and changes minds. I have gotten 1 or 2 emails that said people changed their minds after reading the book, which I think is the greatest compliment. So there was, as I mentioned, a second preoccupation that made me write the book the way I did, that made me stray away from a more general, traditional academic account of trafficking and anti-trafficking in the early 20th century, and instead spend a very large number of years chasing a group of obscure nobodies through the little bits that they left behind in an archive. And the reason I did it, secondly, is because I was also, as I was sort of thinking about the anecdotalization of trafficking stories, I was also thinking about how historians use anecdote in the books they write and the articles they write, and how we explain the past. And it's not that different from the way that anti-trafficking organizations use stories. They tend to present obscure and humble individuals. This is historians, by the way, not anti-trafficking organizations. Present obscure and humble individuals in brief, because it's the only glimpse that we've been able to catch of them in an archive written by the powerful, and an archive that didn't care about documenting their lives and experiences and hopes and feelings. We rarely contextualize these individuals who we anecdotalize in history. We rarely sort of look beyond the identity that we've given them. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone. In my first book, I added what I hoped was human complexity to the story by offering these short anecdotes of women who were arrested for solicitation, of women who broke out of reform homes at night, of women who left London and sought riches in Buenos Aires. But still, they appeared with the identity that I had given them, of sex worker, of prostitute, or of woman who sold sex. I didn't try to find out where they'd come from, what happened afterwards. I was content with just that little glimpse in the archive. And so I started thinking, is it possible to find out more? Is it possible to chase Lydia Harvey off the archive page, off of this file that I found, that I just kept coming back to and reading over and over again? Is it possible to find out her beginning and her end, and to radically recontextualize her in the terms of her own doubtlessly complex life? And so obviously historians have to do this, and I will continue to anecdotalize. But this book is in some ways an experiment in what can happen if we contextualize the people in our stories. And a lot of this rests on what is a kind of quiet revolution of digitized archival resources that we're living amongst. If I had tried to write this book 10 years ago, it would have been impossible. I wouldn't have been able to find the needles in the haystacks that allowed me to use digitized newspapers, birth, marriage, and death certificates, immigration records, and so on, to reconstruct the lives of people who left virtually no writing behind, with the exception of Eileen McDougall and the journalist Guy Scholefield, who neither one of whom, very annoyingly, wrote very much about this case. And so I think that it creates, as Tim Hitchcock says, a more usable history from below, these incredible number of digitized sources out there. And I think that we haven't necessarily thought hard enough about this as historians. And they certainly make extraordinary rediscoveries possible. It helped me find Lydia Harvey. But there are some caveats, because Lydia Harvey never wrote, well, she probably did write many words, letters to her sister and her mother, for example, but they didn't survive. She didn't keep them, and if she did keep them, they weren't kept after she died. And so in the end, I had to play some games with what I was doing, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about the way that I use fictionalization, though not fiction, to communicate the story in the absence of those what historians call ego documents. And I'll just read the research note that came of it, which was one of the last things I added to the book, in fact. But I think it really encompasses my methods for trying to find Lydia Harvey, but also acknowledging the limitations of that search. The lives in this book were found in fragments, and they have been reconstructed using a large number of very small details. These include birth, marriage, death, and migration records from digitized genealogical websites, character-searched information from digitized newspapers, and police, court, and institutional records from archives around the world. These scraps, glimpses, and clues, often little more than a tiny detail in a margin, have been carefully contextualized using both broad and local histories, which have helped me place these historical actors in their time and place. I have stitched these details together with threads of imagination, but this imagining has followed careful rules. There's no detail offered here for which I do not have historical evidence. The weather columns of local newspapers have told me if it was sunny, cold, or raining. Historical photographs, novels, and travel stories have helped me recreate scenes. There are thousands of missing pieces to this puzzle, evidence that has been lost, destroyed, or never written down in the first place. Perhaps there are bits and pieces still lying in an archive somewhere, which I obsess about, by the way, uncatalogued, unindexed, and as of yet unfound. In the places where I cannot know or even glimpse what happened or why, I have carefully deployed the historian's tool of maybe, perhaps, and must have. There are places where the accounts conflict, and where it's difficult to say which clue is more convincing. I have left these moments unreconciled. This is a true story, but it is also a story that insists we think carefully about who gets to do the telling. And so that's where I landed in my search for Lydia Harvey and the methods that I deployed. But I also wanted to know, and I hope this book answers, the ways that this radically contextualized view of trafficking might add to a wider understanding, not just of sex work and trafficking, but of the way that people moved through the early 20th century world, of their mobility and self-fashioning, of their resilience and resistance, of their exploitation and aspiration. I didn't, in the end, flawlessly and completely reconstruct the life of Lydia Harvey, which I'm sure comes as no surprise. But I did find a lot. I visited the place where she was born and I laid flowers at her grave. But there's a lot that's missing in between. And I never truly found her, who exactly she was and what exactly she wanted, and I don't presume in the book to know. But I did find more than I ever thought would be possible, and I hope at least reminded readers of the importance of small stories for understanding both the past and the present. Thank you very much.
I can see you're not going to give anything away, so I may have to do more. The other thing also, I would like to say on the record, officially, that this foundation could not possibly be happier with the outcome of that 1 year, 2014, 2015. And it's partly because the book is great, but it's also because the process that you went through is exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to fund, which is it takes way longer than you think, and it goes down avenues that you had no idea even existed when you started. So this is how intellectual work happens, and we're grateful for the way that you did it. Matt Holbrook is going to speak, and what I just said applies to both of you. I mean, the amount of labor that you both have put into your own work is awe-inspiring. I hope to have the opportunity to say that again before we're done. Matt Holbrook is professor of cultural history and head of the Department of History at the University of Birmingham. He has a BA degree in history from the University of Cambridge and completed his doctoral research at the University of Essex. He works on the cultural history of 20th century Britain with a particular interest in gender, sexualities, and selfhood. He also studies the politics of cultural life, as well as the politics and practice of writing cultural history. Matt's earlier research explored how modern urban culture shaped the ways in which men and women experienced, organized, and understood their sexual desires and practices. And this work led to, among other things, the landmark volume, Queer London, Perils and Pleasures in the Sexual Metropolis, 1918 to 57, which came out with the University of Chicago Press in 2005. Queer London was awarded the Longman History Today Book of the Year Prize and the Royal Historical Society's Whitfield Prize for the best first book on British history, and has in fact been widely read in multiple countries and for anyone who's interested in the history of sexuality. Matt's 2016 book, Prince of Tricksters, The Incredible True Story of Netley Lucas, Gentleman Crook, also with Chicago, recounts the life of this confidence trickster, discredited journalist, and scandalous royal biography as a way of analyzing the crises of confidence that racked Britain in the 1920s and 1930s. The book uses a range of techniques to recognize, rather than conceal, the limits of what historians can know about the past, playing with the boundaries between fact and faction. He is currently working on two book projects, Postal Pedagogies and Capital, The Global Business of Self-Improvement, which traces the remarkable rise and fall of the Pellman Institute and the correspondence course known as Pellmanism, and a book called Seven Dials, A Cultural History, focused on a century of high drama in the famous neighborhood right down the street from here, as metropolitan governance, corporate finance, property development, and diverse local actors clashed by day and night. Matt, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Cool, thank you for having me. It is a real pleasure to be here in person to celebrate the launch of Disappearance of Lydia Harvey with Julia. I feel like I've watched this book in the process for many years now, and when its publication has certainly not disappointed all of the kind of little snippets and bits and pieces and excerpts that I've heard over the years. I'm going to lay my cards on the table right from the very start and say that I think this book is historical writing at its very best. And I find it hard to imagine in the kind of contemporary British Academy a more powerful, more imaginative, a more breathtaking, and more meticulous exercise in historical recovery, historical imagination. It is imaginative, it's compelling, it is impassioned and powerful, and it is deeply, deeply moving. It is a stellar achievement. Every time I read it, I find something else to be angry at, to be furious at, and I find something else to cry at, which when you're kind of travelling on a train from Birmingham to London Euston, first thing in the morning as I was today, can be a little bit socially awkward. It is, I've got to say, one of those books that I wish I could have written, but that I know deep down inside is actually beyond me. So congratulations, Julia. It's really been a pleasure to be here. I think the significance of this book is threefold. First of all, the disappearance of Lydia Harvey in 1910 and the trial of that corpse, and the consequent disappearance of Lydia Harvey, or the erasure of Lydia Harvey from the historical record, is the starting point for a vivid account of the possibilities and the perils of a world and a people on the move. That this is, as Julia tells it, a world that is modernising, that is globalizing, at which the pace, the reach, the scale of the movement is accelerating all the time. And we see this process up close and personal from the ground up, through the eyes of Lydia Harvey and the sort of cast of characters whose stories Julia tells so well. In telling this story, in giving us a kind of glimpse of the aspirations, the anxieties, the fears of Lydia Harvey and other characters, this Disappearance of Lydia Harvey confounds lazy assumptions about the kind of the past, particularly comforting notions of our own modernity and the distance between now and then. And one of the things that happens reading The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey is that time collapses. Partly because it really just struck me that kind of time in the book itself is so compressed into a particularly short period of 1910, but also because this book is so resonant or redolent with comparisons for our own time. It's also then, the kind of second way in which I think this is a significant book, is that it exemplifies the possibilities of thinking critically and thinking historically about histories of gender and sexuality, about histories of labour and capital, and of histories of state and citizenship. It is, on my reading, a kind of reworking or reinvigoration of an older tradition of feminist social historical scholarship, kind of exemplified by the pioneering work of historians like Judy Volkowitz in Britain and Alex Lydia Hartman in the United States. It forces us to think critically and to think carefully about ideas of victimhood, innocence, about responsibility, about regimes of surveillance, of regulation, and of border control, that still shape the debates, the realities, the lived experiences of trafficking and sex work today. Third then, and the kind of final kind of key significance that I see in this book, it sits at the cutting edge of partly a kind of reinvigoration of, or rethinking of what history can be through the use of digital historical methods and digital sources, but also of a kind of transformation of history as a practice, as a genre, as a mode of writing. And I think key here are the decisions that Julia makes about the ways in which she tells her story, about the way, and I use the kind of word storytelling advisedly here. The focus on individual lives, in many ways, is quite a daring move to make. And the commitment that Julia makes to telling stories, more than making arguments, although I think this is a book that's full of important and crucial theoretical and historiographical arguments that we need to take account of. But the commitment that Julia makes to telling stories and to putting individual lives front and centre is absolutely a kind of key intervention in this book. The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey then goes small to think big, and in so doing it transforms our understanding of a big set of historical and historiographical debates, and I think in years to come will provide a model of scholarship, a model of a new kind of historical writing for other scholars to follow. So, I could go on singing the praises of this book, but I think what I'd like to do is to invite Julia to kind of just reflect on a few different issues. Helpfully, this is one of those occasions when I wish that I hadn't written my talk beforehand, because having heard Julia, she's anticipated many of the things that I was going to flag in advance, which I kind of probably should have expected from our conversations over the year. But I'm interested in thinking about the choices that you've made as a historian, Julia. The conditions of those choices, the things that made those choices possible, and also what you might see as the benefits of those choices, but also perhaps the limits or the kind of the things that you've lost through making the choices that you have in this book. So what have you gained and what have you lost in making a particular set of choices as a historian? Choices about sources, about focus, about organisation, about method, and so on and so forth. And I think there are three kind of choices that I see in this book. One is the decision to write a popular book rather than an academic book, in a kind of conventional sense. The other is the decision to focus on individual lives rather than to step back and offer that kind of panoramic history of trafficking that you first promised. And then the third is the choice to engage in a process, I think you called it fictionalizing rather than fiction. And I'd like to kind of think a little bit more about that. Most of all, though, this is a history of a particular moment, a globalizing world in 1910. It's very much present-centered history that speaks to kind of many of the kind of key questions that animate policymakers and individualised society and public debate today. But I'd like maybe to invite you to reflect a little bit on the ways in which the disappearance of Lydia Harvey is marked by the conditions of its own writing. In what way is this book a product of a particular historical moment, our conjuncture? So I'm going to end things there. I could go on, I could keep on singing the praise of this book, but I'm going to stop and just say thank you for listening to me. Thank you, Julia, for giving me the opportunity to sing your praises today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Matt. That was really very helpful. Next, Siobhan Hearn, who is a historian of gender and sexuality in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. She has a BA degree from Swansea University in Wales and took an MA from the University of Liverpool before doing her doctoral work at the University of Nottingham and completing a Leverhulme study abroad fellowship at the University of Latvia in Riga. An internet interview makes it sound like it was love at first sight between Siobhan and Russian culture when she took a Russian history class in high school at age 16, which may partially explain how she's been able to publish a dozen pieces in the 5 years since her PhD, including a co-edited book, Defining Latvia, out this year, and her own book, Policing Prostitution, Regulating the Lower Classes in Late Imperial Russia, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2021. This book is based on archival research conducted in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Riga, Vilnius, Minsk, Kyiv, and Tartu, among other places, and examines how registered prostitutes, their clients, their managers, and wider urban communities experienced and resisted the policing characteristic of the Russian system for its regulation. Siobhan's first publication was on venereal diseases in the Russian Black Sea Fleet in the 1920s, and other papers cover pornography in the Russian Empire, 1905 to 1914, selling sex under socialism, and sanitizing sex in the USSR. Her current project is entitled Molding the Tsar's Men, Military Masculinity and Corporeal Regulation in the Russian Empire. It examines how Russian military and civil authorities, with input from medical experts, use corporeal regulation in their efforts to construct the ideal soldier and sailor, and how military personnel from different ethnic and religious backgrounds experience such regulation. She is also one of the editors of Peripheral Histories, a collaborative digital history project exploring peripheral spaces in the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and post-Soviet world. And she currently holds a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship in the Russian department at Durham University. Siobhan, thank you.
So I'm going to begin, just like Matt, with laying my cards on the table and just say what an absolutely fantastic book this is and what a pleasure it is to be here to discuss it today. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm a huge fan of Julia's work anyway, and continue to be a huge fan, especially after the publication of this book. As Matt said, it's a book to be furious at, it's a book to cry at. I highly recommend everybody in the room reading it as soon as possible. So with my time now, I'd like to spend it reflecting on the significance of Lydia Harvey's story and the meticulous historical excavation work that Julia's done. Some of the chief protagonists of the book that Julia mentioned, Lydia Harvey, Antonio Cavelli, and Veronique White, are subjects that are really notoriously hard to pin down in historical research. Accessing the worlds of perpetrators and survivors of trafficking in a way that moves beyond the narrative simply presented in criminal case files often involves turning to, in Julia's words here, scraps, glimpses, and clues. And I think that pulling together these scraps, lingering on the glimpses, and following these clues allows us to examine hugely significant historical processes through the lives of 6 individuals. But this is not just a book about one trial. Instead, it reveals the tectonic social, economic, cultural, political, and technological shifts that occurred across the world at the turn of the 20th century. And it also allows us to trace the imprints that these shifts have left upon our world in the present day. Mobility is really at the heart of this book. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were this era of frenetic movement, and it's something that Julia illustrates so well. millions upon millions of people boarded carts, trains and ships to travel across continents and settled often thousands of miles from their home regions. Many were enticed by offers of a more prosperous future, like Lydia, dreams of upward social mobility, or merely just the hope of a life free from violence and persecution. Lydia Harvey was just one of millions of young, single, working-class women who left their homes and travelled across oceans as well as national and imperial borders in the early 1900s. Like her millions of counterparts across the world, she lived in various cities and worked in domestic service shop work before finally within the sexual labour market. Antonio Cavelli was one of the 7 million Italians who left Italy at the turn of the 20th century. He and Veronique White were just 2 of the millions of immigrants who arrived in Buenos Aires, a city that was over 50% foreign-born at the turn of the 20th century. These 3 individuals and others that are covered in the book were caught up in these intense flows of licit and illicit migration within increasingly interconnected webs of communication and transportation across the world. Julia wonderfully shows how this increased mobility generated significant anxiety, particularly around issues related to gender and sexuality. In major cities across the world, from Buenos Aires to Vladivostok, rescue workers scoured railway stations and ports looking for lone women travellers in order to prevent their so-called downfall into the world of commercial sex. The pages of tabloid newspapers were filled with stories about how hypermobile foreign pimps and traffickers, who were often racialised as Jewish, Black Americans or Eastern or Southern Europeans, who lured innocent white women and locked them in brothels far from home. The authors of these stories usually took great pains to emphasise the racial differences between victim and perpetrator and the danger of young women being shipped off to foreign, distant-sounding locations. The moral panic surrounding the white slave trade permeated popular culture in the early 20th century across the world, and it actually even became a genre in itself. White slavery fiction and film offered a clear message to young women. Mobility was dangerous and travel carried the constant risk of kidnap and enslavement. This profound discomfort with migration also found expression in the migration regimes of the era. National and imperial governments introduced increasingly restrictive legislation to prohibit immigrants that were deemed to be undesirable on the grounds of their ethnicity, religion, or social background from crossing their borders. These restricted immigration regimes also gave governments the power to deport individuals who were found guilty of certain criminal offences, which often includes, as Julia shows, sex workers, pimps, and even the victims of trafficking that the state professed a desire to protect. Concern about border-crossing traffickers and foreign women selling sex ushered in a new era of international policing and border control, which Lydia Harvey found herself right at the centre of in the early 1900s. Julia really eloquently illustrates in this wonderful book how panic regarding sex trafficking and prostitution became entangled with ideas about the nation, which became especially pertinent when nation-states began to emerge from the ashes of disintegrating empires at the turn of the 20th century. New Zealand journalist Guy Schofield's frank coverage of the Lydia Harvey case, particularly the fact that Lydia had met these traffickers in Wellington, generated an enormous backlash from the country's political establishment, who attempted to prove that Lydia was not a sexually innocent victim, and therefore she was fully responsible for what had happened to her. If Lydia had a dubious reputation, then the reputation of the young country of New Zealand could remain unsullied. Following the trial, the New Zealand government flatly refused to fit the bill of Lydia's repatriation because she was deemed to be of not good character. And the British government were very keen to remove her from the country as soon as possible. The idea that inclusion within the body politic was contingent on conforming to specific standards of usually female sexual morality, alongside this refusal to accept that the conditions that offered fertile ground for sexual exploitation existed within every nation, were core features of state approaches to prostitution and trafficking in the early 20th century. As well as this case with Lydia Harvey and the governments that involved, almost identical discussions were occurring in Ireland, Mexico, India, Nigeria, and the Soviet Union in this period, as well as a plethora of other international contexts. As well as providing this really crucial insight into global processes through this one case and these 6 individuals, this book also expands the lens of who we normally see in trafficking cases, to include not only the perpetrator and the survivor, but also social workers, police, journalists, employers, landlords, migration agents, rescue workers, and government officials. I actually think that Julia offers quite a panoramic perspective that really brings marginal figures right to the centre of the analysis and encourages us to think very carefully about the role that wider society plays in responding to victims of trafficking in ways that makes their lives often extremely difficult. Rescue efforts for victims of trafficking often prioritise moral reform and prepared women for honest work in domestic service, needlework or laundry work. These were all low-paid and exploitative jobs with profound labour shortages, and usually the very professions that victims of trafficking have been trying to leave in the first place. The externalisation of sexual violence onto foreign pimps obscured the endemic, ordinary, local and often less visible currents of coercion, exploitation and abuse. Reporting on white slavery cases in lurid detail may have galvanised public support, but it also erected significant barriers for survivors' attempts to settle back into ordinary life. Volunteer organisations pushed for new laws to protect young women and girls from prostitution and trafficking, but this legislation pushed those who sold sex into more dangerous working conditions and increased their dependency on third parties like the pimps and traffickers. Julia's creativity as a researcher and talent for deciphering the fuzzy margins of the case also takes us beyond the dominant stereotypes of victims and perpetrators of trafficking that were in circulation at the time, and importantly, continue to remain very influential even in the present day. In the early 20th century, the crime of trafficking was imagined as something committed exclusively against white women and girls, specifically those who were sexually inexperienced. Any previous engagement in extramarital sex, or worse still, paid sex, somehow removed the victim's ability to withdraw consent. To qualify as a proper victim or a white slave in the parlance of the day, women had to exercise no agency and demonstrate that naivety was the reason why she fell victim to the trafficker's false promises. Women who could not demonstrate these qualities were deemed undeserving of sympathy and relegated to the category of prostitute, someone who was often depicted as materialistic, lazy and morally lax, and who deserved criminalisation. Julia deconstructs the caricature of the white slave and contextualises Lydia Harvey's choices within the world of risk and rewards that many working class women found themselves in this period. Within this world, traffickers offered false promises or simply an alternative to the humdrum of everyday life. Given the other poorly paid options for female employment and limited opportunities for social mobility and enjoyment, these promises were undoubtedly attractive. Julia also shows how traffickers themselves were not isolated foreign monsters lurking in the shadows, but men who operated within a world of consumption, violence, misogyny and possibility, and made their money within interconnected global economies that were defined by frequent exploitation and high profit. The figure of Veronique White also shows us how the binary between victim and perpetrator, between exploited and exploiter, is often blurry and much more complicated than dominant public discussions of trafficking would suggest. Overall, The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey is very much a book about the early 20th century, but the ideological and even legal parameters of trafficking that are rooted in that era continue to operate in the present day. I'd like to quickly ask Julia 2 questions, if I may. I was really struck by your really beautifully written afterword, particularly your evocative narration of your journey to Lydia Harvey's grave in Newcastle, New South Wales. I wonder if you could share your thoughts on the affective nature of historical research and writing. For example, did you find yourself more emotionally invested in this project than perhaps your earlier work? And secondly, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the unknowability of certain aspects of the history of trafficking. Through these photographs that are wonderfully produced in the book, case files and newspaper articles, we can literally touch the past, but in doing so we're simultaneously made aware of its unknowability, its unreachability. Therefore, what does the historical record obscure, hide or privilege in the history of trafficking? Thanks very much.
Siobhan, thank you. That was a really helpful overview of the core themes of the book. Did you put her up to that?
No, but it worked out perfectly.
It worked out perfectly. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, should I go up
yeah,
there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it easier to hear? Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you both so much. That was really lovely to hear. Thank you, Siobhan, for the pen and also for summarizing the book so well. And Matt, thank you so much for, first of all, for being such an avid reader of the work as it progressed, and for your incredibly kind words about the outcome. And I'll try to touch on some of your provocations and questions as briefly as I can. I'm looking around at my scribbled notes. I think I'll start with choices, and in some ways it kind of blends together all of the questions. Firstly, the choice that I made to have it be a popular history book rather than a kind of stricter academic book. And this was a really easy choice, actually. I knew from the beginning that I wanted to write it that way, but that it also just lends itself to it because I wanted to write narratively, and I wanted to be able to experiment in ways that maybe I think I probably would have gotten away with it in an academic book, but I really felt free to do in a trade nonfiction book for a more general audience. And most of all, I wanted to write a book that people could afford to buy and be able to read, including people who aren't necessarily going to stick with a quite dense academic tome. And I hope they come out the other side just as enriched and just as informed about the core themes of the book that Siobhan really summarized really beautifully. But it's kind of also ties into my choice about the sort of fictionalization. I'm really careful with that word, and I don't want to get into all the kind of theories about fictionality and fiction and fictionalization that historians talk about, and other people talk about, of course, as well. Except to say that the more I kind of threw myself at this challenge to tell a story rather than write a history, and I think you really put your finger on it, Matt, when you were talking about argument, because that was one of the things I panicked about several times in the process of writing, is what's my argument? Realizing ultimately that actually I do make very strong arguments. But I became out the other end of all of those crises more and more convinced that storytelling is one of the most effective ways that we communicate complex ideas and nuance and understanding. It is not a simplification. It is, in some ways, a complication. But that ultimately is also one that people can engage with. And so all of that, all of those sorts of decision makings, and my really now ardent belief in the power of storytelling, not just the power of storytelling to change hearts and minds, but of course that's part of it, but just the power of storytelling as an explanatory device. All ties into why it seemed so obvious that I wanted to make this a book for popular readership. And the other question you asked was why the focus on individual lives. And in some ways I did answer that by talking about how I wanted to fight against anecdotalization and kind of flesh out a complete picture. But there were a lot of choices involved. At first I thought I was going to write a book about Antonio Cavelli, because he's so charming. I mean, he has charmed me from 100 years distance, even though I'm supposed to hate him. And I'll talk about emotion and effective responses in a minute. But then I realized I could not let that man have the last or only word. And that's what made me think, well, why does he need to have the only word? Why can't there be another perspective? And obviously, the perspective of Lydia Harvey. And that's when I started really looking for her, and then found a few things that made me know I could find more. But then I thought, well, why am I just doing it, exactly as you said, to the survivor and the perpetrator? What makes those other people, the people like the journalist who broke the story, or the social worker, or the police, exempt from that kind of storytelling scrutiny, from that kind of personalization? You know, why do we hold the kind of arms of the state as sort of not quite as human as the survivors or perpetrators in a story about crime? And that's when I sort of realized, okay, I've got the shape of the book now. And I want to, the order of the chapters actually was the subject of much discussion. But in the end, you see the first chapter opens with the first kind of half of Lydia's story. And then we move, it kind of sort of stops, and then the police take up the next element of the story. And then the journalist, and then the social worker, and then we switch to the bad guys. And we look at the bad guys. Look at the two traffickers, Antonio Cavelli and Veronique White. And then the book finishes with me talking about the other half, of Lydia's story, what happened when she went back to New Zealand, how she lived the rest of her life. And so, yeah, so it was, I read a lot of different sort of takes on Rashomon. I've become really interested in this kind of history in the round. And it's not just history, it's storytelling in general in the round and what that can reveal. It wasn't easy putting it all together. I regretted my choice a couple times, but in the end, I'm glad I made it. And you also asked, Matt also asked about how it was marked by the conditions of its writing, and it absolutely was. I make no sort of attempt to say that I am an unbiased narrator, neither politically nor emotionally, and I'll talk politically first. I absolutely wrote this book with the political imperative to try to break out of these tired trafficking stories, of the way that we continue to use the criminal law to respond to an extremely complex social problem, the way that we, even worse actually than in Lydia Harvey's time, use border control in the carceral border state to respond to the issue of trafficking. It is not working, it is extremely harmful, and it needs to end. And that was absolutely one of the conditions under which I wrote this book. I was also really struck by how the idealization of victimhood continues to prevail in stories about, not just about trafficking, but in stories about at-risk young women more general and in crime more generally. And this idealization of victimhood has real repercussions because people think they know what trafficking looks like, they think they know what a victim of trafficking looks like, and when they see a real person, giving evidence, say on the stand, they do not recognize the person that they see because she's not a kind of trope or an idealized victim. And that means the case collapses. It happens again and again and again. There's amazing sociological research done on precisely this phenomenon in courtrooms about trafficking in the present day. And I think finally, and this is something else that Siobhan touched on, I was really, really adamant to illuminate, and at the core of the book, ultimately, is Lydia Harvey as a young woman who is a worker, who needs to work to survive in the world. And I wanted to deeply contextualize her experience of sexual labor with her experiences of other kinds of labor, equally as exploitative and harmful, domestic service especially. And I wanted to write a book that made people think about how we obsess about victims of trafficking in the present day, but we give far, far less attention, almost no attention, to the sort of matrix of legal labor exploitation in which young women live and work, even today, and certainly in 1910 as well. And so those were absolutely the political conditions under which I wrote this book, and I make no attempt to hide them. I'm quite open about it. And I hope that I've convinced people. And finally, on the question of the sort of affective and emotional nature and my investment in it, absolutely. That's something else I don't think I try very hard to hide in the book at all. When you research somebody, when you're sort of chasing somebody through the archives and constantly trying to imagine their life and their decisions and their dreams and their aspirations and how they felt after experiences, reading their words as they testify and picking them apart and reading them over and over again, it absolutely means you get emotionally invested. And I felt really silly. I mean, the train from Sydney to Newcastle is very long. It's a very slow train. I don't know if anyone else has ever made that journey. I was initially surprised because it was so cheap. And then the person who sold me the ticket was like, oh, you're going to find out why. And it's because I think I could have run there faster. But it meant that I had a lot of time to think about what am I doing? Why am I going to this young woman's grave? What have I invested in her? This is not a reciprocal relationship. She's dead. But in the end, once I got there, those kind of doubts and questions fell away, and it really felt important that I was at this graveside. This young woman who I had presumed in the beginning of this journey that was completely lost to history, that I could never know anything more about her. And I was there standing at her grave, which is in the shape of a heart. By the way, the only one in the cemetery, that is. And in the end, yeah, and I was sort of thinking, you know, she's not my family, but I felt equally invested in her as though she was an ancestor of mine. And then actually a few months ago, somebody contacted me and said that they're her great-great-nephew, and that their grandmother was her sister, and he hadn't read the book yet. And I was like, okay, you know, I sent a very warm message and said, I really hope that I've done this story justice. You know, it's a difficult, I warned, you know, it's a very difficult story to read about an ancestor of yours. And I waited with bated breath, and he came back with 3 beautiful pages of comments talking about his grandmother, talking about her relationship with her sisters. It was just wonderful. And it made me sort of, it sort of really made me think that my own emotional investment had paid off in the way that I was able to communicate the story with a degree of respect that even an ancestor of Lydia responded warmly to. And lastly, unknowability. I mean, that's part of the unknowability, isn't it? I made a very informed guess about Lydia's sister's birth date, but Bill Burke, who wrote me, told me I was wrong. So that's one, which is corrected in the paperback edition, actually. And like, obviously there's those kinds of unknowabilities, but you know, I constantly thought, you know, there's a reason why I can find Lydia, and I couldn't find other young women who were probably trafficked in greater numbers than people who fit Lydia's profile. I could find Lydia because she was Anglophone and white, and that means that even in an archive that gave little attention to any young woman, there was a little bit left behind. She left a little bit of a record. People cared about her a little bit more because she was Anglophone and white, and she conformed, initially at least, to this ideal victim. And it made me think a great deal about how many young women were trafficked who did not conform to these ideals and who do not show up in the archive in near the same way. It also made me think about the resources that made her visible to me, as in, she's from New Zealand and she spent much of her life in Australia, 2 countries that, because of their settler colonial pasts, have invested deeply in the digitization of their newspapers, their genealogical records, and their archival records. If she had lived pretty much in any other country, if Antonio Cavelli had gotten his start anywhere else but Australia, I probably wouldn't have been able to find them. And so there's a real inequality in the digital archive, as well as in the conditions of the creation of that archive, that's important to remember. And I really thank you for giving me the chance to sort of issue that caveat. I'll stop there. I went on for a while. I'm sorry. Thank you both so much again.
Thank you, Julia. The floor is open. Any and all questions, welcome.
That's a really big question. Yeah, I mean, it's part of that more general story. The question was about microhistory for those who couldn't hear. I call this a global modern microhistory when I'm talking to people who care about those labels. And yeah, it's microhistory definitely comes out of the tradition of history from below, but it does take a slightly different perspective in that it uses these smaller case studies and stories rather than a more kind of prosopographical or data or quants-based analysis of the working classes or those sorts of things. But it's interesting because I did find, and this question I kind of put to anybody who minds to listen, I did find as I was reading microhistories that most of them are not modern. And Matt, this is in some ways a question for you too, that, you know, there's this tendency to use this technique of, you know, zeroing in on a very small story in the early modern and medieval periods because there's so little left behind. So, you know, when you find one juicy thing, you milk it, you make the most of it, you contextualize it. But modernists don't tend to do it as often, although I think we're starting to, I don't know. Because the assumption is, oh, well, we can find out so much, why would we need to do a microhistory? But I hope that I've helped to answer the question of how that technique is still valuable, even when there's so many records that we could potentially use.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I don't think I would have been able to write the book at all. I was still on this original idea of just writing a more general history of trafficking and anti-trafficking. And this was really just a crazy side project that I sort of do to distract myself from the dishes or what have you. And I just started searching, and I signed up to Ancestry and Find My Past and all those genealogical websites, and I would type in her name and go through all the Lydia Harveys, trying to find her. And it took a while. It took the better part of 6 months of doing that kind of stuff to finally find one little key to then unlock other things. And that was true of all the other characters in the book. But I didn't even consider the book until I knew that I had the bones of her story already. But yeah, I wouldn't have been able to write it without.
You didn't have another person that you were going to fall back.
No, there was no fallback. Lydia Harvey's case file is very, very thick. It's really rich. It's sort of extraordinarily rich it's not like a lot of the other trafficking case files. So I already knew a bit from that. And there was really nobody else whose story was as I knew I could get at. There are 3 other young women in the book who are trafficked. They're all from France. And I was not able to find near as much about them, although their stories are there and are what I have is very interesting. But I wouldn't have been able to build a book around them at all.
Because of the archives, or?
Because of the archive, yeah.
It's not digitalized, or?
It's not as much at all, and it's not character searchable. So I would find stuff out about Antonio Cavelli because I could character search for his name in digitized newspapers all across Australia. I found him, playing bocce in Perth. And, that's not going to be indexed or sort of named in any kind of catalog. It only can be found through that kind of searching.
Didn't you have to go to Genoa to get his death certificate done?
Yeah, I went there mostly to sort of retrace his steps. Not Genoa, Turin and Genoa, but Turin was the main place where he grew up. And yeah, I found some stuff there thanks to an archivist who actually translated the files for me, which I'm told never actually happens, but it happened to me. Her name was Silvia Corno, and I'm still grateful. Yeah, so there was quite a lot of physical going around as well, but without the digital archive, it would have been impossible. Oh, that's such a great question, and I wish I had a really easy answer to how we can tell these stories better in the present day. I mean, for one, we really, and it's funny because I joke about The Wire. I say that all the time, but actually The Wire does a very crap job of their trafficking storyline. Like, they do such a good, subtle job talking about drug addiction, drug use, and drug trafficking. And then, I can't remember, is it season 2 or season 3? 2. They go to the docks with the stevedores and the trafficking plot line. And they don't do near so good a job. And I had so much faith that they could. So even when, somebody's taking a subtle view, it sometimes falls apart. But first of all, absolutely get rid of trafficking as a cheap storyline. I mean, you can't get rid of it. I'm not a censor, but this Taken kind of phenomenon where it really is just a plot device, and it's incredibly unrealistic. But most of all, I think, and I'm seeing it a little bit more, is contextualize the people involved. Talk about, why did they get involved in sex work? What were their other labor options? What were their other potential migration routes? In what ways did the migration restrictions mean that they had to kind of throw their lot in with somebody who could help them move? And just listen to people, let them tell their own stories because they're still alive and well and in the present day have a lot to say. So I think there's all kinds of ways, and none of it is actually going to work because I can't be the arbiter of who gets to tell what, obviously. But I think those kinds of contextualizations are really fundamental. Okay, so I think I know what part you're referring to. I'm talking about the context of the mass, the mass migration of working class people, and the way in which their working conditions are very poor. So I talk a lot in the book, I hope at least, I effectively talk about all the different labor contexts through which not just Lydia Harvey, but Antonio Cavelli and Veronique White and others move. So this is a period when working class migration is exploding, it's feminizing. More and more women are moving, and they're moving into highly exploited work. I focus especially in the book on the entertainment industry and domestic service. I could go on and talk about textiles and textile manufacturing as well. But it is an era that is marked by hyper-exploitation and marked by extractive industries. So a lot of the story has to do with mining, actually. Mining comes up quite a lot, which made my work on mining actually super useful. It was one of those things where it just kind of coalesced. So yeah, I could go on, but that's the context in which I'm speaking. And often workers who have very, very few legal rights, either as migrants or as workers in contexts where there's very little labor supervision or regulation. I think I did end up cutting a lot. It could have been a much longer book, as Lindsay knows. But one moment that really struck me was I had a chapter about the moral reformer William Coote, who was the founder of the International Bureau for the Suppression of the White Slave Traffic, the sort of general secretary, the kind of main guy who was in charge of anti-trafficking organizations in England. And actually, he was a fairly rich character. I could find out quite a bit about him because he liked to write about himself quite a lot and all his wonderful achievements. One of his books is called A Vision and Its Fulfillment. And I had a whole chapter on him. I had fit him into the story. He was in part responsible for kind of managing the case when it was in London. And I was writing a chapter, again, one of the things I was trying to do, even with the traffickers, was to be as humane as possible, to always remember that they are human beings, even if it's easier to think of them as monsters. But there was something about William Coote that I just couldn't stand. And it made writing his chapter incredibly difficult. And I think, I banged my head against that for a very long time before I realized that actually it wasn't right for the story. And instead, I focused on the journalist. And there's still kind of a kind of hate article left in me about William Coote. But that was definitely one of the things that got left out. And I think the other one was an attempt to be a little bit more rigorous in my search for the 3 young French girls who were also trafficked. And there was another trafficker, Alexandre de Nicotera, who is in the book, but also had an incredibly interesting life story that I just couldn't get into, because the problem with writing fact, not fiction, is that it's actually stranger than fiction. And so it proved incredibly difficult to tell the whole story exactly as I knew it. Alexandre de Nicotera ended up taking a backseat, even though he's super interesting, and ended up in prison for a while and was an anarchist, and all of these very interesting things that would have made for a great story. But yeah, sometimes you even have to leave the great story bits out.
Matt, do you feel that
Well, when I do have a question, because I want to know, you talked a little bit about the kind of so there's the absent archive and there's the erased archive. But you've also clearly got a kind of fantasy archive of stuff sitting out there somewhere that might turn up. And so I guess what I want to know is what's in your fantasy archive, and as a follow-up, slightly mischievously, do you really want to find it?
Yes, that's a great question. A great question. No, of course I don't want to find it at this point. Unless Profile's interested in a sequel. But my fantasy archive, the very first thing in my fantasy archive is a picture of Lydia Harvey. I know, and part of me, as I belabored, I don't have a picture of her, what does it mean to see a picture of somebody? What does it tell us? Historians of photography obviously would say it tells us a lot, but mostly about the person taking the picture. Why am I so obsessed with seeing her? and knowing what she looks like. And I do have a picture of her, as anyone who read the book knows. The problem is she's in a school picture with 24 other children, and it's not labeled.
Yeah.
So I know she's in there, I just don't know which one she is. But there was a beauty to that. There was a beauty to having to constantly think about her as somebody who could be anyone, but who was also an individual person. And I think that's a tension at the heart of the book that couldn't have existed if I had a picture of her, actually. So, you know, it's that kind of the poetry of the absence and the silence. Certainly, I'd like to know more about why the hell Antonio Cavelli was doing what he did. He doesn't write much, he doesn't leave anything behind, he certainly doesn't explain himself. I'd like to know that.
Yeah, because he's actually not from a hard-up family.
No, he's from a, I wouldn't say cultural elite, culturally elite but not particularly well-paid musical family. So he sings opera, he plays the violin.
He speaks 4 languages.
He speaks 4 languages. At one point he's teaching Latin in the Jesuit school in Perth. Very interesting guy, but again, but that's a fantasy archive that I don't actually think would exist even if I could scour everything. Yeah, so I think I'm happy with what I did find. I think what would break my heart is if I just missed something. Because it's so easy to do when you're writing such a global story and you don't get to spend years in each place searching. But thanks to some archivists who became deeply invested in my search, I found things that I couldn't believe possible, actually. Some really serendipitous, incredible things that archivists were able to scare up for me. I did try. It was actually one of the first things I was doing, because you kind of naturally end up doing that when you're using genealogical search engines, because they're designed for family historians. So Ancestry, when I log on, still says, do you want to add Antonio Cavelli to your family tree? Yeah, I mean, all the world's connected, but I think we're probably very distantly related. And so, you know, I did accidentally find stuff, but what was really striking is that, Emily Badley, who's Lydia's mother, for those who haven't read the book, has 8 children, 8 daughters, no father in sight. So there's 8 daughters with no father. That is extraordinarily strange for a turn-of-the-century New Zealand. There's very, 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 very few other women would have had this experience. And as far as I can tell, none of them had children except for Linda. And that was the sister to whom Lydia was closest and who ended up moving to Newcastle with her and dying in Newcastle in 1959. And so I don't know why, maybe growing up with that many children in the house put you off children. I can't really hazard a guess. But they were a strangely non-procreative bunch, these characters in my story. But it's easy enough to miss it too, because I did miss Linda. She was a wily character. I could not find her very easily. But she did have children. None of them seem to have a picture of Lydia Harvey, fortunately. I don't think there's that old a family archive. I do have pictures of Linda, but not of Lydia. Yeah. So I think that's something I will continue to search for now. That's the one thing I'll keep looking for.
Siobhan?
Yeah, so I wanted to follow back to this idea of the sequel to the book. So you said about Lydia Harvey's case file being so unusually thick, both because she's Anglophone, she's white, she fits this prototype of the victim, but also because of the year that we're talking about. We're talking about kind of the crescendo of international interest in white slavery. Are there any Lydia Harveys in the 1920s or 30s? Did you find anything comparable in later decades? Because I know that the concern around sex trafficking shifts a little bit into those later decades, so could you talk a little bit about that?
It's a really interesting question, and you're right about 1910. Like, there was a synergy, a kind of almost coincidence, but actually probably not. Mm-hmm. As in, this case got as much attention as it did because the people in Scotland Yard, who were kind of high up, said, we need to make this case work because we're under so much pressure to stop white slavery. And I think that's why there was so much investment, so much documentation, and sort of international police investigation. And I think 1910 was an incredibly important year, and sort of few years following it. But then the issue really does seem to fade from view, and a lot of the anti-trafficking organizations said that, kind of wrung their hands in the 1920s, saying, well, the First World War did what we couldn't do, which is stop trafficking, which is actually an incredibly naive take on it, because part of the problem was they thought of trafficking as something very specific, which is women who were not already in the sex industry being duped into the sex industry across national borders. They were far less interested in women who were already involved in the sex industry and encountering exploitation within it, and they were certainly far less interested in people who moved within national borders. But by the 1920s, I think, and you already know this, and it's a very potted history of a complex time, but a lot of the sort of feminist voices that were arguing for what we would today call a rights-based approach start to fade from view. And the International Police Federation and other kind of people involved in the criminal justice world end up getting a much, much bigger space at the table. And it really, really changes the way that trafficking is prosecuted. I don't see the same kinds of files. Most of the thick files from the 1920s and 30s are about prosecuting women for contracting marriages of convenience in order to get into Britain to avoid the new immigration laws that came into effect. So yeah, they're very different. And I do think about what it would have meant for Lydia Harvey had her story taken place in the 20s, or had her story taken place today.
But there's also there's an institutional logic to the archive that you're working with. That the thick archival file is not about preserving Lydia Harvey's story.
Yeah.
It's preserved because it's about establishing precedents in legal bureaucratic policing of trafficking. So maybe there's a sense that it could only be a file from 1910 because that's when the precedents through this case are established.
Were being set, exactly. And like one of the big problems they came up against, speaking of legal precedent, was that the law against trafficking said that a young woman could only be trafficked, or a woman could only be trafficked if she was, and I quote, not already a prostitute or of known immoral character, which is why the Prime Minister of New Zealand stood up in Parliament and denounced her in Parliament and said that she was already a soiled dove before she left New Zealand. Luckily, he did that so that the defense lawyers, the defense solicitor didn't know it before the trial, because if he had, the case would have fallen apart and Antonio Cavelli would have walked free. So they use this case as a test case in many ways for that anti-trafficking law, which is deeply imperfect, but they just managed to get Lydia Harvey to be a good enough victim to secure or to threaten a prosecution. In the end, they pled out, so they struck a plea bargain because the prosecution was nervous that evidence would get out that Lydia Harvey wasn't the perfect victim, that she snuck out of windows, that she liked to sort of dance in Wellington, she had a boyfriend, all of those sorts of things that made her ineligible for victimhood. So yeah, I think that's part of it, is that, and it's a good news story, right? Like, the cops didn't think so. The main police officers in charge of the case were really disappointed by and very angry about the outcome. They thought 6 months was far, far too little. 6 months without hard labor was far too little. The deportation order wasn't followed up, so they just basically saw them on a boat to Genoa, and then they immediately rebooked and went back to Australia and just started it all over again. But I think the police establishment was really pleased at how it turned out. It didn't get a lot of news attention because it's the same moment that Crippen is happening. I don't know how many people are familiar with Crippen, but yeah, so Walter Dew kind of upstaged Ernest Anderson. So they were slightly out of the limelight, but I think that's why they kept it, because it showed the cops were doing something about trafficking, and it was also a very handy guide to how to prosecute.
All right, it's 7:30. Please join us. We're just moved here to the courtyard for some food and drink and further conversation. I would like to thank the panel for being fabulous, you for bringing Lydia Harvey and other women like her back into history, which is an incredible work for us and for them. Please join me in thanking Julia and the panel for